Good morning. Ukrainian Crisis Media Center is starting its work with an exclusive event. We are going to discuss the results and the outcomes of the Ukraine-EU summit. In the mass media, we've been seeing a lot of different assessments, and Ukraine is now approaching to the EU from the moment it submitted the application, and today's experts will describe the pace of our movement forward. It's my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Ihor Seletskyi, our today's moderator. Good morning, dear friends. We are beginning our first event, the Ukraine-EU summit, the public and non-public dimensions. We have today our interlocutors, Ms. Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze, Member of Parliament, Chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on EU integration on Ukrainian integration to the EU, His Excellency Mr. Tobias Tyberg, Ambassador of Sweden to Ukraine, Mr. Zhovkva, and Mr. Mahda. The summit, which is now finished, comprised two big parts. The first part of it was dedicated to the Ukrainian accession to the EU, prospective accession to the EU, and the second part or block was dedicated to the Russian-Ukrainian war, and we are very grateful for the support to Ukrainian fight with the Russian Empire. But during today's event, we would like to discuss different things. We believe that the intriguing news before about the summit came even before it. We should not expect for the express accession to the EU, and all the dignitaries during the summit mentioned that we should not expect for that, and Ukrainian Prime Minister also changed his mind about the possibility of doing that. Ivanna, some time ago in your article, you warned the authorities that that could happen, and whether you agree that with the idea expressed in some media that it was the purely economic summit devoted to purely economic dimensions of the Ukrainian accession to the EU. Thank you, Igor. Thank you to the Euro-Atlantic course, and thank you to CMC for this opportunity to share our thoughts and feelings and observations over truly historic events that happened during February 2 and 3, and on February 2nd, there was the panel, the session of the Commission, and on February 3rd, Ukraine participated in the summit in new status, the status of the candidate country, which was a new status and a new position for Ukraine. I agree with you, Igor, that there were two trends of discussions I mean the security and the Euro-integrational ones. And I should say that the security dimension prevailed during our discussions, and the European Union continuously keeps saying that all the European countries are ready to support Ukraine in its fight against empire, against dictatorship, and, in my opinion, against the universal evil. And for us, it is very important that there's all European unity in this, in supporting Ukraine, would be preserved, and that readiness to provide us with political and humanitarian support would continue. And for us, it is also important that the European Union would increase pressure upon Russia via sanctions. And I hope that there's a vision of needed sanctions. The vision from Ukraine will be considered when deciding about the 11th package of sanctions. Then I believe that during the summit, the European Union has opened several programs, several EU programs available for Ukraine. Although it was just mentioned in general about Ukraine's access to the European economic market. Actually, this means that Ukrainian enterprises would be able to participate in some bidding for goods and services, and this absolutely does not mean that we are entering the joint market, of course, and this also means that the European Commission will extend the privileges for taxes and duties on Ukrainian products which are being supplied to the European market. And I think this is important for Ukrainian economy. Then this includes the progress in signing the AC agreement, etc. All that is important, but in result of this summit, we had seen or observed two contradicting trends. I mean, further continuation of Ukraine's ambitious expectations as to the EU membership. The office of the president and the government of Ukraine, the parliament, all those institutions are eager to start membership negotiations by the end of this year. I believe this is quite ambitious goal, but I think it won't happen unless we fully implement all that 7 requirements that was set in the candidate document. And during 2 days after end of the summit, I have noticed that the main outcome is that everywhere it is written that there is going to be the European Commission report in spring, and afterwards we will rapidly move forward. I prefer that Ukrainian society would hear the truth, that it is a good output of this summit, that we have this perspective of the report to be produced in spring to analyze the mistakes which, in implementation of those 7 requirements which we had made during the last year. But based on that report, the countries will be able to make their decisions. And later on, in autumn, only the countries, based on the results of the report, all the EU member countries, maybe His Excellency will correct my understanding, but as far as I understand, that only in October we will see the final report, based on final version of the report, based on which and upon decision of all the EU member countries will be able to start negotiations. I think it's not right to increase expectations in Ukrainian society in this very moment when we are fiercely fighting, when we suffer because of huge bloodshed on the battlefields. We should not deceive the society. We have heard from the European Union during this summit. We are very attentively observing what you are doing. We follow up your actions and your achievements all the time, and we expect that you will comply with the rule of law, with the democracy principles, that you will develop democratic institutions and compliance with all those 7 recommendations that were produced to match all the democratic requirements of the EU. So what I suggest, we should correctly understand the signals which were sent to us by the UN summit. Of course, for us, the expression of the readiness to start negotiations is an important signal, but democracy, pluralism in the parliament, independence of all the governmental institutions, and specific steps to implement the recommendations, these should be the preconditions for our positive movement forward. I read the communique and joint statement very carefully, and I have noticed that the EU expressed that they very attentively follow up Ukraine's progress, while Ukraine stated that it is going to move forward as quickly as possible. This is not the adequate parity, and I believe that this is an important question. Thank you. Your Excellency, would you please continue discussion after Ivanna? And for many years, the economic cooperation with the EU was of primarily importance in our discussions with about Ukraine's accession. Don't you think that now the political aspect had become the central issue? Why it happened that the freedom, democracy, and the rule of law had become the central issues of these discussions about Ukraine's accession?
Thank you very much. No, I think you're absolutely right that the political elements of Ukraine's continued integration with Europe has become more important in the recent year, and the reason why is very, very simple. The reason why is because on the 28th of February 2022, Ukraine applied for membership in the European Union. That's the answer to your question. In order to become a member of the European Union, in order to be eligible for membership in the European Union, a country needs to fulfill the Copenhagen criteria, and these are criteria which refer to the most fundamental political values that Europe stands for. These are issues of democracy, human rights, and rule of law. So I think so I think that's the simple answer to your question. It's really not much more complicated than that. The context within which this happened was obviously the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, and I think the reason why the invasion has launched this increased attention on the political elements of European integration is because that invasion finally eliminated any hope that there could be a way for Ukraine to continue integrating with Europe in a way which wouldn't be met by Russian aggression. So Russia has effectively accelerated Ukraine's European path, and that is what we see today.
Дякую.
Thank you. Is Vitaliy connected? Good morning, Vitaliy. Vitaliy, I have a question to you. Some experts believe that the countries who are leaders in Europe have come to consensus that the extension could not or enlargement could not happen unless the fundamental rules of voting in the EU are changed, namely the rule about consensus, and the second is about quotas in the European Parliament and the Euro Commission, and some experts, other experts also believe that as of the moment we can discuss only economic cooperation with the EU, not political integration. What do you think about that? It seems to me these are quite preliminary discussions. First, I cannot imagine that the European Union could be reformed quickly in terms of the rules of voting. You might recollect the draft constitution which was prepared under chairmanship of Monsieur Giscard d'Estaing, and I cannot imagine a referendum during which the citizens of a EU member country may reject their right to make decisions. As for the issue of quotes of seats in the EU Commission, because we do not know the population, the figures of Ukrainian population at the end of Russian-Ukrainian war, because Ukrainian population is obviously shrinking, and in theory Ukrainian population was around 40 million people, and optimistic forecast of experts is around 30 or even 25 million. This is not a big amount of population for Europe, and the quotes for this number of population would not be considerable. What is important for us? First of all, the end of combat activities and the situation with Ukrainian borders as of this moment, and nobody knows the final date for the war, and everybody understands that the combat activities they obviously hamper Ukraine's accession to the EU, and Putin understands this quite well, and because of this reason he's not going to finish them in order to have the hot conflict. And this will hamper the political will in the European Union. Then the second aspect is that Ukraine has to pass through definite political processes without complete fulfillment of those 7 preconditions or recommendations which are written in the document. We won't be able to access the EU, and it may take dozens of years to fulfill them, to curb corruption, for example, in Ukraine to a satisfactory level. Then, to start negotiations, we need another very important preconditions to settle our relations with our neighbors, and without that our accession won't be possible. His Excellency may describe the relations with Turkey, for example, which hamper the Sweden accession to NATO as of today. And I can assure you that Ukraine's relations with some EU member countries may be even more complicated than the Swedish-Turkish relations. And at the moment, we will try to start negotiations. We immediately would hear from these countries which legislation we have to change about national minorities, what amendments we should introduce, etc., etc. And Ukrainian diplomats will travel continuously between Budapest, Bucharest, and, sorry to say that, Warsaw, and we're trying to settle the disputable issues in our joint relations. And can you imagine the membership of Ukrainian parliament, which will be able for the legislative amendments required by the governments of all those countries? That's why now, when we are fighting for the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and the end of the war with Russian Federation, I'm afraid it will be very difficult to dream about all of that. Of course, we would like to speed up the process to prevent becoming a Turkey in this respect. On the other hand, there could become a reality the fact that Ukraine would not be able to maintain itself because of protracted military conflict. And what do you think what this current summit step forward? Any summit between EU and Ukraine is a step forward. Your Excellency, what do you think about the prospects of Ukraine accession to the EU? Is it possible in nearest perspective?
I think, commenting on the issues that Mr. Portnikov raised, they were all relevant. Obviously, it's relevant that Ukraine is currently a country at war. Obviously, it's relevant that Ukraine currently does not have sovereignty over its entire territory according to its borders under international law. Obviously, it's true that there are certain elements in the bilateral relations of Ukraine with certain EU member states which complicate the accession process. Mr. Portnikov mentioned Hungary, Romania, and Poland, and that is issues relating to national minorities. All of these things are true. But I think there's sort of two things which need to be kept in mind at the same time. The first one is look at how far Ukraine has already come, and these issues are not new. These issues have already been there. This is the nature of politics, and this is the nature of political change. There are always very strong interests that need to that collide when historical political decisions are made, and that does not mean that historical political changes cannot be made. So I think, whereas I agree with every individual point that Mr. Portnikov makes, I think that the general impression that his intervention leaves is too pessimistic, because if it were the case that every time there are political challenges in the way of achieving certain goals, those goals cannot be realized, then Europe today wouldn't look the way it looks. If you just recall what Europe looked like 30 years ago and compare it to what Europe looks like today, these are two different worlds. And despite this horrific war that we're seeing in Europe today, I think there can be no doubt that Europe today is a better place than Europe 30 years ago. And that is exactly because the kind of challenges that Mr. Portnikov refers to have been overcome. But this requires obviously great political leadership. And it does require the leadership within Europe, of the European institutions and of the individual European member states, and it requires the leaders of Ukraine to show that they are up to the magnitude of the challenges, the historical challenges we face today. So I think I cannot sort of presume to put a kind of a time estimate to when it will happen, but I think that membership of the European Union is absolutely a realistic goal for Ukraine. And I would even venture so far as to say that it is a historical responsibility of the leaders of both Ukraine and Europe to ensure that that happens.
Дякую. Пані Іванна,
Ms. Ivanna, some experts believe that one of the biggest achievements of that summit was that in the statement it was mentioned that the assessment will be done earlier than in autumn, and the paragraphs about international tribunal as to the crimes committed in Ukraine. What do you think? I believe that irrevocability of Ukraine's accession, that Ukraine definitely will become the EU member despite of the challenges, despite of the tragic events. I believe this was the biggest positive outcome of this summit. That political elites in the West, those advisors who participated in the summit, the president of the commission, and other dignitaries, they mentioned that they do not see a possibility for Ukraine to stay beyond the European Union. Obviously, this vision is now starting to prevail in the EU. For us, it is extremely important. I fully agree with Mr. Tobias that this is a historic responsibility of both Ukrainian and European leaders to make this true, this accession. And this is the reason why I believe that the year 2023 provides big opportunities in terms of the general mood of leaders in the European Union, and Mr. Charles Michel and Ms. Ursula von der Leyen expressed that very clearly. This is a chance for Ukraine to make a step forward and state openly that we are ready to start negotiations. Next year, such an action will become a bit more complicated. Many EU countries will have elections, and the European Parliament will be re-elected, and any election campaign puts all the active processes on pause. And I believe that the rapid opening of negotiations should happen by the end of 2023 or early in 2024. By that moment, we should finalize our home assignments and make necessary step forward. And I fully agree with Vitaliy that for us, it is going to be a challenge. A challenge in terms of bilateral relations with our neighbors. In some issues, I mean, all of us know that this is almost 6 years now that the decisions Ukraine NATO are being hampered by Hungary, and Hungary never prevented decision making in terms of the support during this war, but regular sessions of Ukraine NATO Commission are blocked by Hungary because they believe that Ukrainian law on languages somehow should be amended, and that Ukrainian language that Hungarian language should receive some privileges. And all Ukrainian attempts to change or to amend the law to improve situation with the Hungarian language in Ukraine, and all the efforts made by Ukraine to explain that Hungarian language is very much supported and developed in Ukraine, they resulted in nothing. And we believe that Hungary may continue to insist on the implementation of some conditions for minorities in order to make it possible for Hungarian government to implement their own policy, which has nothing in common with the real situation of national minorities in Ukraine. I believe that risks of this kind should stimulate us to do our best and to to comply with all the requirements set to us and to implement all those requirements at a perfect level, at a such perfect level that any attempts to blackmail, so to say, Ukraine that we do not comply with the EU requirements in some aspects, like that example with national minorities, would obviously be not true to all the EU members. And in case we do our home assignment in perfect way, will create for us a chance to win this consensus from the EU in internal discussions about possibility to open negotiations with Ukraine. Thank you, Ivanna. Vitaliy. Sometimes we get an impression that in the EU we have Mr. Charles Michel and Ms. von der Leyen. On one side, Mr. Charles Michel mentioned that Ukraine may get her accession within 2 years. Ms. von der Leyen also said something similar, while on the other side we have the European bureaucracy. What can we do to gain the support from European bureaucracy? It seems to me that this is a natural situation in the EU. There is a European Commission which deals with the issues related to the existence of the EU, which is able to see the global dimension in Europe and of Europe, especially when we speak about Mr. Charles Michel and Ms. Ursula von der Leyen. They are enthusiastic about European project, and not only in terms of Ukraine or Moldova, but also in terms of the Western Balkans. And the example with Bosnia and Herzegovina is a good example, which seemed impossible a year ago. This is all done with the intention to create united Europe, which is not a union with holes on the map. Of course, it's good if a hole looks like Switzerland, but it's bad if this hole looks like Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the second aspect is about money. The money directed to the European or allocated for the European needs. The national governments, they think in the national dimension. While the European leadership thinks in the dimension of all European scale. Just imagine that the head of all European Council is elected by the general vote in all the member countries. It can easily, in this case, it could happen that the EU president would not be Mr. Michel, but somebody else. That's why I understand. My understanding is that Ms. von der Leyen, Mr. Michel, and all the Euro commissioners, they are more free in their visions and decisions than national bureaucracy and governments. Vitaliy, in the context of political statements made by Ukrainian authorities that we're going to get our full accession status within 2 years. How do you think what Ukraine should not do in order for successful accession? Ukraine should not allow to abuse the martial law and the war situation to turn it into authoritarian state. Otherwise, we are threatened to become like Russia. Thank you. Actually, the same question I would like to ask to all the roundtable participants, what Ukraine should not do for successful accession to the EU. Ukraine should not do imitations that are pretending that it is doing something. Ukraine should not produce slogans which can mislead people and create and just make an appearance of something. And I agree with Vitaliy that today we are fighting for our own right to choose, to disagree, to have discussions. For us, this is the war against dictatorship and empire, and an empire. And because of that, all the free world today is supporting us and stay with us. We may recollect that back in 2014 here at Maidan, there was a huge big board saying that freedom was our religion. To some extent, this is true. Ukrainian leaders should not forget that Ukrainian society, this is about freedom, about democracy, and about different opportunities. That's why centralization of power is not what Ukraine should do. Your Excellency, what Ukraine should not do in order to make the accession successful?
I think my answer is this. I think in the context of a war of aggression of the kind that Ukraine is currently the victim of at the hands of the Russian Federation, I think it is very natural for there to be a strong focus on the centralization of power, and I think that's understandable and that's normal. But I think it's also extremely important that Ukraine fully recognizes that one of the reasons why Ukraine has been able to withstand this Russian aggression so successfully, one of the key reasons is exactly because Ukrainian institutions, Ukrainian democratic constitutional institutions were so much stronger than the Russian Federation thought. Obviously, Russia wildly underestimated the strength of Ukrainian society, of the Ukrainian economy, of the Ukrainian military, and of Ukrainian institutions. And I think that one of the very important things now is that in the context of this war, it is extremely important that Ukrainian authorities ensure an environment where those institutions can continue to function and continue to develop. Now, Why do I say this in the context of a certain centralization of executive power, which is natural and normal in a time of war? I say it specifically, I'd like to mention one particular reform, and that is local self-government. I believe that one of the many reasons why Ukraine so successfully withstood the full-scale Russian invasion in February 2022 was because Russian municipalities, hromadas all over the country, had been empowered through decentralization reform of the past many years into a position where they took responsibility for their own communities rather than waiting to be told by Kiev what to do. And I think that triggered a huge creative power and huge amount of initiative all over Ukraine to do the things that needed to be done at all levels, from the military to the economic to the social, to ensure Ukrainian survival against this aggression. And I think that the successful reform, decentralization reform, was one of the reasons why that worked so spectacularly successfully. And I think this is just one key example of how important it is that Ukraine's democratic institutions continue to develop. So I think this would be the one thing that I would suggest that Ukraine must not do going forward, and that is to allow the consolidation of executive power, which is a natural and normal consequence of the war, to be allowed to start eroding the extremely important democratic reforms that Ukraine has successfully conducted in the last 30 years. Thank you.
Дякую, пане посол. Мабуть, власне, те, що зараз сказали.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I believe that what was just said by our panelists is actually about the political part of Ukraine's future accession of the EU. I would suggest to start the Q&A session. Do we have any questions from present journalists? Good morning. I have a question to all the panelists. On the eve of the full-scale aggression, we observed that for the first time after 2014, supporting society to the Ukrainian accession to NATO was consistently dropping, and some people thought that NATO did not do enough to help Ukraine to get prepared to the war. Although NATO had not do that, so how the question is how to overcome that transfer of responsibility in Ukrainian society from Ukraine as the main actor on the European institutions or NATO institutions. One more question to pick up, and then we will start answering. I'm Verkhovna economic analyst. Mr. Portnikov has said that much may depend on those people who are in power in the European Union. On the other hand, in Ukrainian society, we have multiple attitudes and ideals. For example, we do not know what was the capital of the first the first capital of the Soviet Ukraine was not Kharkiv, as many people believe. That was Belgorod, Russian Belgorod. And in Hungary, many people are believers of the Greek Catholic Church. And so my conclusion is that many Ukrainians do not know their history. So now my question comes, whether there is any possibility to explain to people their history. And my specific question to His Excellency, quite often in Ukraine, we recollect the war between Russia and Sweden, and that the Swiss were allies of Ukrainians in that war, and whether there are any historic studies about that period of early 18th century. Let me start answering the questions. How to transfer responsibility from, how to stop putting responsibility upon the European institutions instead of Ukrainian ones in Ukrainian society. This is not only the issue of legislation. You cannot get accession to the EU only via amending the legislation. You have to work with institutions, with businesses. You have to do a lot of training for those people who should implement this new legislation. And a big deal is to create a strong negotiators team who will carry out negotiations. One of big friends of Ukraine in the EU once said to me, this are not going to be negotiations. This is just exception of the rules which are already produced in the EU. And we have to explain all that. We have to explain that to Ukrainian society. And this should be done not only by the bureaucrats, by public officials, but by activists of the civil society, by journalists who should not just produce slogans and create an impression that we are moving forward rapidly, but have to assure people and prepare them to the fact that we have to do a lot of homework. And one short comment to your statement that Ukrainians are not familiar with their own history. I should say that Ukrainians, you may observe the growing interest in society to Ukrainian history, and the interest to Ukrainian history is growing European-wide, so to say, because Ukraine is coming back on political, or coming new to the political map of Europe. And in this context, I would like to point out to the school exams, which I do not remember how it is called now. This is independent external assessment of the school knowledge. And recently, Ukrainian Minister of Education decided that history of Ukraine should not be excluded from the list of compulsory subjects to be assessed during and evaluated during this exam, this general school exam. And I believe this is a wrong decision, and the parliament many times encouraged the government to steer up discussion how it would be possible or maybe made possible for Ukrainian students, Ukrainian children to study Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian language, and Ukrainian history as their school subjects when online, when they have no possibility or opportunity to go to Ukrainian school and attend Ukrainian classes. His Excellency may be will mention how joint Ukrainian-Swedish history and the joint aspects of Ukrainian-Swedish history are studied in the Swiss universities. We have researchers, scholars who do a lot of work and in this area. And we have scholars who work in the Swedish archives. Quite recently, a book was published which summarizes the documents which were from Swedish archives. I am very grateful to Marina Tradner, who made this work, who translated them, the documents. I believe that there is a good example of our joint work in this area. Thank you. I would like to add, before I give the floor to His Excellency, our civil organization, which produces releases about bilateral relations, and our special release about Ukrainian-Swedish relations was very successful because Ms. Stratner and the Swedish archive very eagerly responded to us on that matter. Your Excellency, would you like to add a couple of words?
Really, just to confirm what the gentleman who raised the question about history says. A few things are more important, I believe, at the current time than to improve the knowledge of history. And it seems to me clear that denying the reality of Ukraine, denying the reality of the Ukrainian nation, the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian language, and of Ukrainian statehood, this is all part of the Russian imperial colonial project. And this is a project which began many centuries ago, and the most recent manifestation of this imperial Russian colonial project is the current invasion of Ukraine. And this is an invasion which is not only about territory, it's not only about armies, it is also about minds. Russia wants to colonialize not only the Ukrainian land, it also wants to colonialize Ukrainian minds. and the way it tries to do that is by denying the very existence of Ukraine. And so I think the point that you raise is really exceptionally important. And I'm not going to go into sort of specifics about Swedish-Ukrainian history. You mentioned Charles XII, who fought with Mazepa against Russia in the early 18th century. There are many other examples. For instance, Yaroslav the Wise, who was married to a Swedish princess, and 3 of their children ended up on European thrones. I think the key point about examples like this, and there are so many examples, not only involving Sweden, but involving many European countries and their historical relations with Ukraine. The key point about this is that all of these historical facts remind us of the European identity of Ukraine. They remind us that for more than 1,000 years, Ukraine has been an integral part of the European family, through peace, through war, through alliances, through marriages, through trade, through economics, through intellectual history, through social history, in so many different ways. History reminds us all that Ukraine not only exists, but exists as a European nation and also as a European state. And I think this is a very important thing to keep developing, because unfortunately it is a very, very conscious state policy of the Russian Federation, not only to kill Ukrainians and to destroy the Ukrainian state, but to destroy the very idea that Ukraine can exist. Thank you.
Дякую, пане посол. Пане Віталій, чи є у вас щось?
Thank you, Your Excellency. Vitaliy, would you like to comment on something? Vitaliy has no comments as far as I understand. Let's finish our roundtable at this high note about European integration. I'm very grateful to the roundtable participants. Thank